In the fall of 1700, Europe's mightiest throne was held by a man whose body had already become a living corpse. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Habsburg kings, passed his final months in a condition so appalling that his own courtiers muttered he must be possessed by devils. What they saw in those closing days would sear itself into European memory forever, a dynasty that had dominated the continent for centuries collapsing alongside the decaying flesh of its last heir. Charles II's death would not merely extinguish the Spanish Habsburg line, it would hurl the entire continent into a catastrophic war that redrew the map of power for generations to come. Yet the deepest terror was not the political fallout, but the ghastly sight of a human being slowly falling apart while frantic courtiers inflicted ever more savage rituals in a doomed effort to save both their king and their empire. This is the tale of how centuries of royal inbreeding forged a living monument to human suffering, and how one man's prolonged agony altered the course of world history. Eyewitness testimonies and medical notes from Charles's deathbed draw a portrait so harrowing that historians still struggle to describe its full horror. What follows is not simply the chronicle of a monarch's death, but a grim witness to the ruinous price of absolute power twisted by genetic disaster. The Spanish court's frantic efforts to heal their dying sovereign laid bare the darkest recesses of 17th-century medicine and superstition. For more than 2 centuries the Spanish Habsburgs had governed one of history's largest empires, stretching from the Americas to the Philippines. By the late 1600s Spain was still a great power, yet fissures were appearing both in the empire itself and in the bloodline that ruled it. For generations the Habsburgs had married within the family, convinced this would keep their lineage pure and their authority intact. Born in 1661, Charles II was the culmination of that deliberate inbreeding. His father Philip IV and his mother Mariana of Austria were uncle and niece, his grandparents had been first cousins, and the same pattern of close kin unions repeated further back. By the time Charles was conceived, the family tree had knotted so tightly that his inbreeding coefficient surpassed that of a child born to brother and sister. The court had long known their royal blood was producing ever more fragile heirs. Charles's elder brother Philip Prospero died at 4, several other infants and children meant to inherit the throne perished young. All hope for the survival of Habsburg Spain now rested on Charles alone, and the pressure on him to live, and to sire an heir, was crushing. From his earliest days Charles exhibited the physical and mental defects that would torment him for life. He did not walk until he was 8, spoke intelligibly far later, and suffered from an enormous tongue, a grotesquely protruding jaw, and a catalogue of other deformities. His intellect was profoundly impaired, he was subject to seizures and outbursts of wild behavior. Nevertheless, upon his father's death in 1665, the 4-year-old boy was proclaimed King of Spain. His mother, Queen Mariana, ruled as regent, struggling to preserve the illusion that her shattered son could govern one of the world's greatest empires. As neighboring kingdoms sensed frailty, the Spanish court grew ever more isolated and suspicious. Europe's balance hung by a thread. Louis XIV of France was steadily expanding his reach, while Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I fought to preserve the old order. Both monarchs possessed credible claims to the Spanish throne through their own Habsburg marriages, and both waited only for Charles to die childless. The question of who would succeed him had become the central diplomatic crisis of the age. Twice, in desperate bids for an heir, Charles had been married. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, died mysteriously in 1689, poison suspected, after failing to conceive. His second, Maria Anna of Neuburg, fared no better. Charles's ruined body made fatherhood all but impossible. By 1700, as the king entered his last year, panic barely concealed gripped the court. His health was collapsing with terrifying speed. Foreign powers maneuvered openly for the coming carve-up, while courtiers resorted to ever more extreme measures, anything to cure their sovereign or at least wring a legible will from him before the end. Autumn 1700 saw Charles's decline accelerate into free fall. Physicians recorded that he could scarcely stand, his wasted legs refused to bear him. The infamous Habsburg jaw now jutted so far that he could not close his mouth, drool poured constantly, and speech was almost unintelligible. Food slipped from his lips when he tried to eat, swallowing had become torture. Ambassadors wrote home of a king whose face was deathly white, whose huge eyes bulged from their sockets, whose skin looked waxy and translucent, and whose hair fell out in clumps though he was only 38. Mentally he was disappearing. He would stare vacant for hours, then suddenly shriek or laugh without cause. Servants heard him holding long conversations with empty air or insisting invisible figures stalked him. His bowels had rebelled completely. Chronic diarrhea left him soiled even during formal audiences, to the mortification of foreign guests. He kept down almost nothing, only watery broth or diluted wine, and vomited even that within hours. Sleep fled him, guards reported screams of terror echoing through the night, yet when they burst in they found him alone, cowering, babbling about demons clawing at him. Days passed without rest, driving him deeper into madness and collapse. The stench rolling off his body grew so vile that courtiers drenched themselves in perfume before approaching. His breath alone could make seasoned advisors gag. Worst were the seizures, ever more frequent, ever more violent. He would collapse thrashing, eyes rolled white, foam spilling from his mouth, limbs jerking beyond control. Each attack left him longer to recover, and onlookers felt something human slipped away with every fit. The royal doctors were helpless. Bloodletting, purging, potions, nothing slowed the inevitable. Running out of science, they began to wonder whether medicine alone could ever save their king. As 1700 wore on and Charles weakened further, the Spanish court slid into supernatural panic. Physicians, their learning exhausted, suggested the king's torments might not be natural at all. Priests and theologians were called in, many declared his symptoms textbook demonic possession. The Inquisition, still formidable, demanded evidence, but witnesses queued up to describe the king's conversations with the unseen, his unnatural strength in convulsions, his impossible knowledge of distant events. Father Antonio Maricar, the court's chief exorcist, examined Charles and confirmed every classic sign: unknown tongues, superhuman force, clairvoyance. He urged immediate, intensive exorcism. The first rite took place on a freezing November night in the royal bedchamber. Charles was strapped down while Father Marischal intoned the long Latin formulas meant to drive out Satan. The king reacted instantly and horrifically, screaming in a chorus of voices, childish shrieks mingled with bestial growls. Soon the sessions became semi-public theatre, nobles invited to watch the war for their monarch's soul. Bound with leather straps, doused in holy water, surrounded by choking incense, Charles clawed until his wrists bled and bit his tongue to bloody froth. The rituals could drag on for hours while he roared prayers, curses, and what listeners swore were demonic tongues. Afterward he lay half dead, skin burned and blistered, breath a rattle. The court convinced itself progress was being made, pointing to rare moments of clarity when Charles seemed to recognize faces or speak coherently. Priests hailed these as victories, they never lasted. News of the royal exorcisms electrified Europe. The French ambassador reported to Louis XIV that Spain had lost its reason along with its king. Protestant courts seized on the spectacle as proof of Catholic barbarism and Spanish decay. The Marquis de Louville, an undercover French observer, sent back dispatches later unearthed in Versailles that remain among the most vivid records of those months. His Catholic Majesty offers a sight so pitiable that even his enemies might pity him, he wrote. Speech nearly impossible, jaw hanging in a permanent rictus. Louville witnessed an exorcism and wrote that no torture chamber he had seen matched its horror, the screams reverberating through the palace, servants crossing themselves in the corridors, the king left afterward, still as a corpse, breathing so faintly we thought him already gone. Dr. Miguel Fernandez, the king's personal physician, kept meticulous notes that survive in palace archives. In October 1700 he recorded, bowels in constant evacuation, solid food impossible, limbs so feeble the king must be carried like an infant, mental powers fading daily. Of the exorcisms he wrote bitterly, they exhaust the patient beyond endurance. Any fleeting improvement is instantly undone by the violence inflicted. We are killing him faster than preserving him. His voice was ignored. Queen Maria Anna of Neuburg, in private letters to her sister, confessed she could no longer bear the same apartments, nightly screams of demons tearing at his limbs, the overwhelming smell of putrefaction. I have begged separate chambers. I fear for my own sanity. She felt the entire court watching her, expecting the impossible, that a wife who could barely remain in the same room might somehow heal him or force a clear will from his lips. Servants, though few could write, gave oral accounts to ambassadors. One chambermaid swore she had seen the king crawling the corridors on all fours at night, howling and tearing at walls until his fingers bled. Guards found him in the chapel on his knees, pleading either for cure or for death. Great nobles confided to friends that attending court had become a trial of endurance. The Duke of Alba wrote, "We preserve the pretense of serving a king, but we are merely spectators at a lingering execution." By late October 1700 no one could pretend the end was not weeks away. Charles never left his bed, consciousness came only in fleeting shards. His body had shrunk to a skeleton wrapped in skin, courtiers spoke of a living corpse. Europe openly debated the dismemberment of the Spanish Empire. Two claimants, Archduke Charles of Austria and Philip of Anjou, had powerful factions at court, and the palace rang with intrigue even as the king gasped his last. In rare lucid intervals courtiers pressed him to sign a will. He could no longer grip a quill, scribes guided his trembling hand, producing scrawls later contested as forgeries. Rival factions took turns at the bedside, each hoping for a deathbed nod in their favor. Exorcisms intensified. Father Marishala and his priests kept almost permanent watch, performing shortened rites whenever the king stirred. Medical care was abandoned entirely, priests insisted pain was necessary to drive the demons out. Queen Maria Anna withdrew completely, frantic letters flying to foreign courts bargaining for her own future. She wrote of guilt warring with terror, unable to watch the final unraveling. The palace became a house of the dying, whispers in corridors, routine suspended, ambassadors dispatching hourly bulletins. On November 1, 1700, All Saints' Day, the king lay unnaturally still after months of torment. Many saw the calm as proof the devils had finally fled. Father Marishala kept vigil, touching relics to the royal forehead, murmuring prayers. Charles's lips moved silently, prayers, perhaps, or last words to the spirits that had haunted him. Around noon he briefly opened his eyes, seemed to recognize faces, tried to speak, only a gurgle emerged before he sank back. It was the last flicker of awareness. Death arrived quietly at about 2:30 in the afternoon, almost an anticlimax after the preceding horror. Physicians waited nervously before pronouncing it, several times before he had appeared dead only to revive. This time he did not. Protocol was observed, the body left untouched for an hour, final prayers said, the exorcist declaring victory over the demons. Then the machinery of succession lurched into motion. Word leaked within hours, by nightfall riders were galloping across Europe with news that would ignite the War of the Spanish Succession. The autopsy 2 days later, performed by Doctors Fernandez and Antonio Jenga, revealed devastation beyond anything suspected. The heart was tiny, black, shriveled, like leather dried in the sun. The lungs were half-rotted cavities. The brain was child-sized, riddled with cysts and old bleeds. Stomach ulcerated, intestines inflamed and blocked, liver hardened by decades of toxic remedies. Bones twisted and brittle as an old man's. Most ghastly, several organs already decaying while he still breathed, living putrefaction. The physicians concluded, it is a miracle this body sustained life for 39 years. Death must have been the kindest release from suffering no mortal should endure. Copies of the report soon reached foreign courts, ammunition for those who wished to portray the Spanish Habsburgs as degenerate and their claim forfeit. Within days France and Austria were mobilizing. Louis XIV proclaimed his grandson Philip V King of Spain, citing a will Charles had supposedly signed. Austria rejected it, branding the dying king incompetent, possibly still possessed. England and the Dutch, fearing French dominance, backed the Austrian candidate. Propaganda seized on the exorcisms as proof of Spanish backwardness. The empire fractured, colonies and European possessions declared for one side or another. Trade froze, bonds crashed, bankruptcy stalked European finance houses. By 1701 Europe was at war on 4 continents. One genetically ruined man had, by dying, set the world on fire. Modern genetics confirms the catastrophe. Charles's genome matched that of a child of siblings. Centuries of calculated marriages had strangled the bloodline in its own noose. His death ended not just a reign but an era. The War of the Spanish Succession redrew borders, crowned Britain supreme at sea, began Spain's long decline, and accelerated the Enlightenment by exposing the grotesque superstition clinging to Europe's mightiest Catholic throne. Above all, the story of Charles II is a human tragedy dressed in crown and ermine. A boy born to rule half the world, yet condemned from the womb to a lifetime of pain, humiliation, and terror, then subjected in his final months to torture disguised as salvation, all so that courtiers might salvage political advantage from his ruin. His agony reminds us that palaces and cathedrals offer no shield against mortality, that power can magnify suffering as easily as it bestows privilege, and that even the grandest dynasties are, in the end, only flesh, fragile, fallible, and doomed to rot. The Spanish Habsburgs died with Charles II on that quiet November afternoon, but the warnings carved into his broken body still whisper across the centuries: absolute power corrupts absolutely, blood cannot be hoarded without poison, and every human being, no matter how exalted, deserves compassion when the darkness finally comes.